Hi everyone, welcome to a series of videos on geo-cosmic trend analysis. This first one we'll be looking at the long-term trend analysis of market crashes. So in this analysis I'm looking at the FTSE 100, which is a leading stock market index for the UK. We're looking at a period of 46 years from 1984 all the way through to 2030. Over this period, we've seen 4 market crashes, and we'll be looking at each one and understanding the astrological aspects of the planets and the correlations between those aspects and what happened in the markets. So the first crash we'll be looking at is the 1987 crash, referred to as Black Monday. We'll move on to looking at the early 1990s depression and the dot-com bubbles of 2000 and the global financial crisis of 2017. Throughout the analysis, I'm going to be using this graph. It looks a little bit busy, so let me just spend some time explaining it. This is a graphic ephemeris, so it's showing the movement of the planets across time. So you have the years shown across the top of the graph. We've also got the planets shown by their glyphs and their movements across time. I'm only looking at the outer planets from Saturn outwards. So we've got Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto, and the lunar nodes will be shown on there as well. It's important to note that this ephemeris is drawn to the 4th harmonic, which means the chart runs from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. And as the planets move through those degrees of the zodiac, it'll go back up to the top and carry on their movement. The reason I've chosen to draw the graph in this way is because it clearly shows the hard aspects happening at the conjunctions at 0 degrees, the square aspects at 90 and 270, and the oppositions at 180. So these hard aspects are the ones that are best correlated when looking at the financial markets to large movements and swings in prices. This blue line here, this chart shows the movement of the FTSE 100 across time, and you can see the price of the index shown by the blue figures on the left hand side. So looking at this period, as I mentioned, we can see some of the market crashes, and I've shown the market crashes by numbering them. The lows we see, the first one we see was in 1987, followed by the early 90s, and then we had the dot-com bubble as our third crash, and the final low we had was in 2007, 2008. These are referred to as market troughs. So the troughs are right at the bottom, and the crests are right at the top, the height of the market. And I've shown these alphabetically. So let's look at the first market crash. It happened started on the 19th of October 1987, which is referred to as Black Monday. Most of the global markets dropped by over 30%. I think the Hong Kong index dropped by over 50%, and it was driven by a lot of banks in Hong Kong itself. That it happened during an atmosphere of uncertainty and confusion, which affected investor confidence, and it happened very quickly within one day. The reason for that was with the advent of computers, a lot of investment and trading houses were using computer programs to trade, and the computer programs were essentially looking at the trend of the market and basing the decisions based on that trend. What happened on that morning was a lot of the market makers had the right to delay some of the markets when there was sudden movements, which then put the futures market, which is the derivatives that were being used um, for underlying stocks, it put that market out of sync with the actual underlying stocks. So moving into 1987, obviously prices were rising, and generally the futures markets would be a little bit trading at a little bit higher in terms of their prices than the underlying asset, the stocks for companies or in the indices. And what happened on that morning was there was some pent up downward pressure, which meant suddenly there was a drop in the markets. The futures market started to sell heavily, and these were computers that were suddenly picking up on this and trading very quickly. And a lot of the market makers had the right to delay the opening of the market, so they delayed it by about half an hour. And what happened was the underlying asset value, the stocks, were trading at much higher prices than the futures. Obviously, then people wanted to sell those stocks because they could see the futures were falling and dropping, and they weren't able to do this, and this created a sense of hysteria. The events surrounding Black Monday, to me, all resonate with a Mercury retrograde, and it's interesting when we look at the chart to see that there was a Mercury retrograde on that day. Mercury is a sign, is the planet for traders. It also resembles markets, trading activity, and telecommunications and communications in general. And what we're seeing here is a market crash that was essentially led by computer programs. Now, what was the cause of this crash? I believe the main cause was the fact that Saturn and Uranus were coming into a hard aspect, the hardest aspect that we have, which is a conjunction. The conjunction was happening in the sign of Sagittarius, which itself is a sign for computers, technology, and speculation. It's a fire sign, so speculation is very strong, and we'll see further down the line in 2007 there was again a lot of presence within Sagittarius, which is linked to speculation. And what triggered this event? Well, the trigger is always, we always have to look at the inner planets from Mars inwards to find the exact trigger. And we can see there was an exact opposition between the Sun and Jupiter on that day. Now, it's interesting. Why is Jupiter being pulled into this? It is one of the outer planets, and the reason I've wanted to pick up on Jupiter was because Jupiter was in trine aspect with Saturn. The two had been in conjunction at 4 degrees Libra in 1981. Now, 1981 was an important year. When Saturn and Jupiter go into a conjunction, this is referred to as a great conjunction. It's historically, astrologers have paid a lot of attention to great conjunctions, as they believe big and important events happen during those periods. Now, for the past 200 years, all the great conjunctions have been happening in earth signs. So the earth signs are Virgo, Capricorn, and Taurus. And in 1981, this was the first time that a great conjunction occurred in an air sign. The air signs are Libra, Aquarius, and Gemini. And why is this important to us? because we're currently going through a period where the great conjunctions are moving out of happening in earth signs, and from the great conjunction that we're going to have on the 21st of December 2020, from this point onwards, all the great conjunctions will be held in air signs. So the December great conjunction of this year is going to happen at 0 degrees Aquarius, and for the next 200 years, all great conjunctions will occur in Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra. So going back to the great conjunction that happened in 1981, this began a period, and a 20-year cycle essentially, from one great conjunction to another, where we got a glimpse as to what it may feel like to have great conjunctions in air signs. Now, earth signs are very much related to industry, to minerals, to the extraction of oil, and metals and coal. And 200 years ago, when the Great Mutation happened, and the Great Mutation is referred to as the period when the Great Conjunctions changed signs. So when the Great Mutation happened from fire signs into earth signs, we saw the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly we had railroads being built, we had a huge growth in the Industrial Revolution, starting in the UK, in cities like Birmingham and London, and it worked its way across Europe. And we saw a change happening in the early 1980s. From 1981 until the year 2000, we saw a period where the Great Conjunction happened in air signs. Air signs are associated with the power of thought, technology, the internet, space. And we saw in that 20-year period the advent of computers and telecommunications. We had mobile phones being built, personal computers coming into people's homes and being affordable. And we went from a point where there was very little technology being used by everyday individuals from 1980s to the point where in 2000, when the Great Conjunction ended in the air signs and moved back into ended in the air signs and moved back into earth signs. In around 2000, we saw the creation of the iPhone. So we saw a huge transformation for humanity, and I think that gives us a real glimpse into where the future of our technology and economy will go. Now, when you're looking at planetary harmonics, and in this instance I'm looking at Saturn and Jupiter, the seed was sown at 4 degrees Libra, and the two planets start moving. Obviously, Jupiter moves a lot faster than Saturn. Its cycle takes 12 years, whereas Saturn's cycle around the zodiac is 30 years. So the two planets will slowly start to apart from one another, and we can see at this point they're at a very positive aspect, a trine. A trine is a resemblance of growth. If you look at the life cycle, it's known as the spring. It's a point at which, if you think of the seed being sown at 4 degrees Libra, the idea being born, and we look at this simile of that to a literal seed being grown. And when you get to a trine, that's a point at which you're flowering. The tree starts blossoming. It will go into an opposition, then it will go into another trine. The second trine, referred to as a waning trine. This is waxing because it's then moving away from each other, but that have not reached opposition yet, so it's waxing. So this waxing trine is the blossom, and the waning trine will be when the tree gives fruit, and it's the harvest. So these are very positive aspects, and in so much as what was happening with technology at the time, we can see we'd made great advances to the point at which traders were actually using computer programs to pick up on market movements and trade. So, and it was those computer systems that really led to this crash. So it was a computer generated feedback loop which created this compounding effect of a fast and sharp fall, which then affected investor confidence. So that's why Jupiter is involved in these aspects, and the Sun being in opposition to Jupiter acts as a trigger for when this event actually occurred. I also want you to pay attention to Venus and Mercury being in very close proximity of a conjunction with Pluto. That would also have led to a timing trigger. The way I like you to think of this, when you're looking at astrology and planetary harmonics, think of it as a key that's going through a lock. The key is pushing down all the pins and needles within the lock, and the first pins and needles that get pushed down are the outer planets. So they determine the bigger picture, what's going to happen. And when you get to the inner planets, they are the last pins and needles to fall into place when you push the key in and allow the event to manifest. So we always look at the outer planets for what is about to happen and use the inner planets, the faster moving ones, to work out when exactly during the year or as we approach an aspect is that event going to happen. Therefore, don't be surprised that Saturn and Uranus were not exactly conjunct with each other at 23 degrees or 24 degrees of Sagittarius, because that is close enough. They were in orb of a conjunction, and it's inner planets that determine at what point during that year that event is going to manifest. So that's enough on Black Monday. What's the next recession that we have on our list? It's a recession of the early 90s. Let's look at that and understand what happened in the early 90s. Well, during that period, there was restrictive monetary policy being enacted by most central banks in Western countries in response to inflationary pressure. So we're just coming out of the period of the Cold War. The German unification is taking place. We're entering a period where prices are generally rising. So we've got inflation, and the central banks want to control this inflation. And the way they do this by applying monetary policy is to raise interest rates. By raising interest rates, people will hopefully stop spending so much and save their money, therefore trying to reduce demand in the market to control inflation. Now, a lot of people may remember this because as interest rates went up, and this in the UK at least, people were no longer able to afford their mortgages. I think it went up as high as 16 to 19% per annum on the interest rates, and people were just not able to pay those high rates for mortgages, and a lot of people had to essentially hand in their keys to the bank and say, you know what, have it back, we can't pay these mortgages. Now, what else was putting pressure on inflation? Well, we know that Iraq attacked Kuwait it was around August 1990 that they actually attacked Kuwait, and this resulted in a sudden increase in oil prices, and this put further inflationary pressure on a lot of Western countries. As a result, markets around the world dropped by about 20%. What was the cause? Now, whenever we're looking at recessions, we should always start with the outermost planet, and that's Pluto. So we can see Pluto was in Scorpio, which is the sign of warfare It's also one of the signs related to minerals and mining. So it's no wonder that oil was involved here, and some we can see that another key factor as to the cause of the recession was the fact that the North Node was in Aquarius. Now, generally, and the movement of the North Node is anti-clockwise through the zodiac, so it goes this way around. The North Node is always in direct opposition to the South Node, and the rest of the planets are moving. The rest of the planets are moving anti-clockwise around the zodiac. The North Node is moving clockwise, so in an opposite direction. So when we look at this on the ephemeris, so we can see all the other planets are moving downwards through the ephemeris from left to right, whereas the North Node is actually moving upwards in opposite direction. So the cycle of the North Node through the zodiac it's an 18-year cycle, and what we will notice, and I'll go on to show in a later video, is that every time the North Node goes into Aquarius, we see a period of recession or a market crash happening. So I've put the main cause of this market crash down to the fact that the North Node was in Aquarius. Another important factor to note is that the outer planets, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, are all forming a stellium in Capricorn. Now, Capricorn, it rules over the government, and it does rule over markets as well, and business activity, the banks, the most established in industries within a country. Neptune is a ruler of oil, and Uranus causes abrupt movement, sudden movements. It's a planet that seems to shake the order and the norm. It creates market bubbles, and is a cause of essentially havoc throughout our world. So a lot of wars and earthquakes can be linked back to Uranus. So we can see the fact that these three are in such close proximity it is another cause and factor for this market crash. In terms of timing, why did it happen on this specific day? Well, we can see that the Sun is in conjunction with Jupiter in direct opposition to Saturn. Now, it's interesting to have Jupiter in Cancer, because Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Jupiter is linked to inflation, and when it's in its own sign or a sign of exaltation, it will result in inflationary pressure. So it's no surprise at that period we were seeing inflationary pressure, which central banks were trying to control. Another interesting factor with regards to banks being involved here, the central banks, we said Uranus is the cause of sudden changes, sudden movements. It causes bubbles in markets. So banks are associated with Capricorn, so they were setting monetary policy using interest rates, and we can see Uranus has entered this sign, so there was sudden abrupt changes in monetary policy during that period. Moving on to the next recession of the dot-com bubble of 2000. This was a period of excessive speculation in internet-related companies, with the advent and growth of the internet itself. There was a lot of promise and hope that these companies would generate a lot of money, and around the 24th of March 2000, the markets crashed, especially technology companies around the globe crashed. The Nasdaq is the best index to look at, and it lost about 80% of its value as a result of that crash. Interesting to note, at the beginning of this video, I pointed out that the great mutation that we're about to experience this year, the start of it is this year, with the great conjunctions happening in air signs. We had a taste of what that would be like, and the great conjunctions happened in Libra in 1981, and you can see it then ended in April 2000. So this crash happened just a month before it, as these planets were within orb of a conjunction. So we can see a link again to technology, and the reason I wanted to highlight this is we're looking at the cause. Why did this market crash at this time? We can see the North Node in this chart is just about to come out of Leo. If you remember, I said every time the North Node is in Aquarius, there's a period of depression and recession. When it reaches the opposite side, Leo, that's a point where we see the market reach its crest, its highest point. And as it suddenly moves out of that point, there's a sudden drop. That's not the only reason why this recession happened, though. Much more important factor was at play, and that was Uranus was in hard aspects. So there was a square between Uranus and Saturn happening, and every time we see a hard aspect between these two planets, again it results in a crash of some sort. Now, you'll also recall I said Uranus creates market bubbles. And what sign was it in? Well, it's actually in its own sign, Aquarius, which is a sign of technology, computers, internet. So it's one of the air signs. So we can see the bubble was, the .com bubble was created as Uranus was in this sign. So a couple of factors all pointing that to the fact that we're going to have a stock market crash around technology companies. This is quite important because next year we're about to see another hard aspect form between Uranus and Saturn. Only this time round, Saturn and Jupiter are going to be in Aquarius because the great conjunction is happening in Aquarius in December this year. So as we go into 2021, the two planets will move forward within Aquarius, and Uranus is currently in Taurus, the sign usually associated with stock markets. So is there a stock market bubble being created, and will it burst? We'll look at that within our forecast in a later video. Another important thing in terms of the timing. So we know these aspects were all going to create a lot of pressure, downward pressure on the market. And what was the trigger? When did it actually happen? We can see the trigger for this crash was as Mars suddenly enters Taurus. So Mars usually creates sudden movements. It's coming to the sign of stock markets. It's approaching that conjunction, and another factor which is quite important is we can see we got a waning moon, and the moon is very closely related to how the markets behave. I will look at that in more detail when we look at short-term trends in markets. But I just wanted to point out that it's a waning moon and a moon in Scorpio, which means it's in its fall. It's in a very uncomfortable place and can result in mass hysteria and sudden movements in prices. So we can see from the top of the market, the crest, in 2000, the markets dropped. The FTSE 100 took a sharp fall, and this period lasted about 2 years until markets started to recover. And the final, just before we go on, I just want to point out, when I'm showing you the zodiac here, and we can see Uranus is in a hard aspect with Saturn. Let me just point that out to you on the ephemeris here as well, so you become familiar with it. So we can see Uranus was in Capricorn and worked its way through Capricorn. In mid-90s, it moved into Aquarius. So as it's moving into Aquarius, that's a point at which it had a hard aspect with Saturn. You see the brown line is Saturn and the blue line is Uranus. Let me see if I can zoom in and show you this. Right there, as these two lines meet, that's where the hard aspect is actually being formed. Right, so let's move on. So this final crash was the global financial crisis. This was as a result of excessive risk-taking by banks in the way they were giving mortgages, and then repackaging these mortgage products and reselling them and remarketing them. So it resulted in the subprime lending market, and it started in the United States. The crash actually started in the United States in October 2007, but it wasn't really until September 2008, a year later, that it was with the announcement that Lehman Brothers had gone bankrupt and that the governments were not bailing them out, that the real bear market came into place and prices on all the stock markets started to drop. Most markets lost about 50% of their value. So what can we see? What was happening astrologically? We can see Pluto was in the last phases of Sagittarius, about to move into Capricorn. We said Sagittarius was all about speculation, and what led to this stock market crash was essentially speculation, excessive risk taking. What can we see was the cause of it astrologically? So this was a reason as to what had happened. Which one of the planets or pairs of planets in terms of harmonics or nodes caused it? Well, we can see a north node was in Aquarius again, where it was a period in which we were expecting a market downturn. And with regards to the timing of it, we can see there was a full moon happening in Pisces, right at the point where Uranus and Saturn were also in opposition. So we said these two pairs of planets, when they're in hard aspects, do bring about sharp falls in the market, and we can see that indeed that did happen. So two factors were at play here. It was the fact that there was a hard aspect between Uranus and Saturn, and the fact that the North Node was in Aquarius. Let's have a look at that. On the graph, we can see the North Node in around 2006 had moved through Pisces, and in 2007 had entered into Aquarius. At the same time, we can see Uranus was making its transit through it was Pisces at that time, and we can see that Saturn was in opposition in Virgo, and the two formed a opposition right at the point at the low of the market. Now, apart from looking at planetary harmonics and linking these astrological events to the movements of the market, it's always good to use some trend analysis as well. If you're looking at the market at such a high level, you can see that the general movement of the market is going upwards, be it with much larger oscillations as time goes on. And we can see when it dropped, it actually dropped to the similar points that it had gone to before. This is usually referred to as a support line when we're looking at trend analysis on the stock market. So its peak or its resistance point was the same as the one we'd seen in the late 90s, and its support was at the same point that the markets had dropped to in around 2001, 2002. That obviously the dynamics change once it passes this resistant line in the 2000. You can see over here in 2017. Once it passes that resistant line, then the dynamics will change slightly. But it's good to pay attention to these factors. So what conclusions could we draw? And just bringing this video to an end. We generally, when you look at back through history, we should have a recession every 6 to 10 years on average. And we've just gone through a period from 2007 to 2020 of 13 years without a recession. So a recession is long overdue, and some would speculate that there's pent-up downward pressure building up, which could result in a bigger crash than we've seen before. Looking at prior market recessions, we would expect the lunar nodes and the planetary pair of Uranus and Saturn and their harmonics to be of importance when we're looking at recessionary pressure and timing. And we would always look at the inner planets from Mars through to Mercury and the Moon, and to essentially tell us when exactly during the year we're going to face a potential crash. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and please go on to watch the second video in this series, which will analyze the astrological aspects that result in recessions, and hopefully we can then use that to forecast with regards to what we would expect the market to do in the coming years.